Okay, speech and language disorders. This was a much larger topic than I expected it to be. So this might be kind of long. There's a lot to go through. The federal definition for speech and language disorders is in IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. It defines a speech and language disorder as a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So, I want to unpack that just a little bit. There's a few kind of features of that definition that I want to talk about. It's a little bit, well, you'll notice immediately that it's quite a bit shorter than most federal definitions. So it's a little bit on the simplistic side. It doesn't draw any explicit distinction between receptive and expressive language capacity. There's no real language in there that focuses on receptive language difficulties. So everything that they mention here, with the exception of language impairment, is talking about expressive language difficulties. So a dominant feature of this definition is that it sets the bar for impairment at adversely affecting a child's educational performance. So the emphasis is external. The focus is on the condition. It's not on the condition, but it's on a specific expression of that condition. So those are kind of the problems with this definition. I want to take a look at an alternative definition. This is the American Speech Language Hearing Association's definition. A communication disorder is an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process, and comprehend concepts or verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbol systems. A communication disorder may be evident in the processes of hearing, language, and or speech. A communication disorder may range in severity from mild to profound. It may be developmental or acquired. Individuals may demonstrate one or any combination of communication disorders. A communication disorder may result in a primary disability, or it may be secondary to other disabilities. So I want to unpack this one a little bit too. Right away you notice this one's much more expanded. This is a much bigger definition. This is actually a definition of communication disorders, which the federal definition alludes to that. It says a communication disorder such as blah blah blah. So we're talking about the same thing, but the American Speech Language Hearing Association is talking about more things in this definition. And right away we see that a communication disorder involves difficulties with both receptive and expressive communication. So I think that that's a really good feature of this definition. And we also see that this definition establishes a family of disorders, and then it explains that they can exist independently of each other within a specific individual. So I think both of those are really strong features of this definition. The American Speech Language Hearing Association also has separate definitions for what they call the 4 different kinds of communication disorders. They divide it into speech, language, hearing, and central auditory processing disorders. I'm not going to go through all of those definitions, but you can pause the video and read them if you'd like. Let's talk about kind of the relationship between speech and language disorders. Language and speech disorders are independent families of disorders. But due to their interrelated nature, there's a lot of overlap. It's possible to have one and not the other. Speech impairment without language impairment, vice versa. No problem. But the federal definition, the IDEA definition, combines them into a single thing. So having both speech and language disorders combined in a single definition includes a really wide range of cases under that single category, and it makes for some complicated situations. So depending on what state you live in, if you are a child with speech only marked on your IEP, you may or may not be eligible for speech sped services. In some states, if a child has a speech diagnosis but no other diagnosis, they can't get speech therapy through sped services. They have to have a separate disability that qualifies them separately, and then they could get sped services for that disability and also their speech disability. So the American, what is that name of that? American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA, their expanded definition of communication disorders are more inclusive and detailed compared to the federal definition, but they are compatible descriptions of the same concepts. And therefore, I think that they're really useful in conjunction with IDEA's definition. IDEA's definition is the federal one. It's the important one for legal purposes, administrative purposes, but I think that ASHA's definition really contributes a lot to our understanding of what these disorders are. And I'm just going to say one thing real quick, also about ASHA's definition. They include hearing disorders under the umbrella of communication disorders, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I think I wrote something about that. Yeah, it's notable because IDEA's definition does not include hearing disorders. So that's going to be hardness of hearing and deafness. And I think clearly there's a lot of overlap between all four of these categories that they have under this single umbrella of communication disorder. I think it makes a lot of sense to include hearing disorders. But that's all I'm going to say on it for the moment, because our textbook actually deals with all of that separately. So I'll just let other people pick that up. Okay, let's talk about language disorders. So we need a lot of specialized terminology to describe language disorders. One of the most important kind of like duologies is the distinction between expressive language and receptive language. Expressive language is our ability to express what we, our ability to communicate with other people by actually producing language. Receptive language is going to be our ability to comprehend language that other people produce. Because of the wide variety of cases that fall under the umbrella of speech and language disorders, children may experience a disability with expressive language, receptive language, or both. And this can manifest in a whole host of variety of different ways. The textbook, here's a quote from the textbook. Students with language disorders may have significant and chronic problems related to any one of the discrete components of language outlined, or they may have disabilities that encompass several of these components. So these are the components that you see on the screen right here. We have phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can pause the video and read it. Basically, these are linguistic terms that we use in order to describe the structure of language. Here. The structure of a language or the form of a language, that's going to be phonology, morphology, syntax. Semantics is more or less going to be the content of what we're saying. So phonology, morphology, syntax, those make up kind of the vessel, if you will, and semantics is going to be what we put in that vessel. So that's going to be the actual meaning of what we're saying. Pragmatics is a little bit more nuanced. Pragmatics is how that sort of package, that vessel and the contents of that function in a social human environment. So that's basically the overview there. And like the textbook said, a language disorder can impose difficulties with any one of these elements or with any combination of these elements. So obviously, this is a complex term, right? Language disorder. I mean, this is a single term for a wide variety of complex problems that an individual can have with language. I had to throw this in here because my wife is a linguist, and so I kind of get some of this stuff by osmosis. This sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, it's kind of meant to illustrate in a humorous way why semantics is important. So this sentence is syntactically correct. There's nothing actually grammatically wrong with this sentence. So the vessel that we've created with grammar here is fine. It's perfectly acceptable according to the rules of the language. But the content, so like the actual meaning that this sentence carries, is completely intelligible. So that's just kind of the joke there. These are the names of specific language disorders. So I included these just to kind of show you that there's such a wide variety of language disorders you can have. All of these disorders are going to be characterized by... We can describe the effects of all of these disorders in terms of those elements of language that we just talked about. But there's also going to be like peculiar properties of these disorders that are specific to the disorder. We'll talk about specific language impairments in a little bit. Language delay is what we call it when a child is not developing at the pace that they should be. They're not developing at a normal pace in terms of their language development. Aphasia is the loss of language development at a later date. That's typically going to be brain damage, but not always. Central auditory processing disorders. I had a little bit of information just on the screen about that earlier. That's in the ASHA definitions. I'm not going to go into that in this presentation because it's really complicated, and frankly, it's going to be a long presentation anyway. Selective mutism is, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. That's when a child is hesitant to speak or unable to speak in certain contexts and in certain situations. For a variety of reasons, a lot of them emotional. Specific language impairment I wanted to address because it is so common. So this is from a Department of Health website, but specific language impairment is a language disorder that delays the mastery of language skills in children who have no hearing loss or other developmental delays. It's one of the most common childhood learning disabilities. It affects approximately 7 to 8% of children in kindergarten. It's suspected to have a strong genetic component, but the cause is actually unknown. The genetic component is a promising angle that they're researching. Having difficulty using verbs is a hallmark of SLI. Typical errors that a 5-year-old child with SLI would make include dropping the S from the end of present tense verbs, dropping past tense, and asking questions without the usual be or do verbs. For example, instead of saying she rides the horse, a child with SLI would say she ride the horse. Language disorder assessment is going to be fairly similar to speech disorder assessment. Excuse me. There are formal tests. I've got some of those on the screen. Personal history is going to be important. So the speech pathologist or speech therapist is going to be speaking with people that know the individual closely, teachers, classmates if the individual is older, but mainly parents Um, Personal history is an important component of diagnosis. Observation in various settings, in and out of school. Various settings is important because people interact with their environments differently. Student artifacts, written school assignments are usually a very important component of the diagnosis, and interviews with the individual themselves, and also people that know them well, like teachers and parents and that kind of thing. So we're going to move on to speech disorders. And like language disorders, we need some kind of specialized concepts and terminology in order to describe speech itself with enough specificity and accuracy to really pinpoint what exactly is going on with a speech disorder. So speech is divided into 4 different dimensions. We've got voice, resonance, articulation, and fluency. And I've kind of organized this chart to show you voice and resonance problems are going to be categorized as voice disorders. Articulation problems are going to be categorized as articulation disorders. Fluency problems, fluency disorders. And it's fairly self-explanatory, but again, I've got all the information on the screen. You can pause the video and read it if you'd like. So we're going to look at, these are some specific speech disorders and their names, but basically everything is going to fall into one of these 3 categories: voice, articulation, or fluency disorders. Fluency disorders, stuttering and cluttering, so we're all pretty familiar with that. Articulation disorders are going to be problems characterized by omissions, substitutions, additions, distortions, and voice disorders are difficulties with pitch, volume, projection, etc. And again, this is just to show you that there are a lot of disorders associated with speech. These are all speech disorders. Apraxia is one of the more common ones. But there are lots of them, and many of them have to do with paralysis of different parts of the physical apparatus that you need in order to produce speech. Some of them are neurological, so on and so forth. There's just a lot of them. Speech disorder assessment is going to be fairly common to language disorder assessment. There are formal tests. They mostly have to do with articulation, as you can see from their names. Personal history, again, very important. But the speech pathologist is also going to be interested in spontaneous language samples, and these are going to come from a variety of different settings. So the speech pathologist is going to place the individual in a situation where they're going to elucidate spontaneous speech, spontaneous language from them. And informal interview with the individual themselves, and usually with parents and teachers and so on and so forth. And a very important component of assessing speech, speech disabilities is examination of the physical structures that produce speech. So the teeth have to be aligned well enough for the sounds to be produced correctly. Abnormalities in the hard palate can be a problem. Lips and tongues have to be able to move normally, and breathing patterns, of course, because we produce speech by pushing air through our vocal tract. Causes of language and speech disorders are fairly expected. There's biological and there are environmental causes. A big category of subcategory of causes is abnormal or impaired functioning of the central nervous system. And somewhat unexpectedly, that would include intellectual disability. So a lot of kids with autism have speech disorders, and in those cases, autism is the primary disorder, and the speech disorder is the second is kind of a side effect of their autism. So that still falls under the category of biological causes. Cerebral palsy is another big one. It's considered a neurological cause. Neurological hearing loss. Even though hearing loss, so deafness and hardness of hearing, aren't considered a speech and language disorder under IDEA's definitions, hearing loss, whether it's neurological or conductive, is considered a cause of speech and language disorders. It's considered a biological cause. You can also have physical disabilities, weakened speech muscles, emotional disabilities, for example, emotional problems like an internalizing disorder or depression, those kinds of things. They can cause emotional factors that really limit a child's ability to express themselves. So again, the emotional disturbance would probably be considered the primary disability, and the speech disorder would be a secondary disability. Congenital deformation. This is a big cause. Cleft palate is actually fairly common. I've got a diagram of it over there. And cleft palate, so if the hard palate has a hole in it, then there's no barrier between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, which, if you think about it, would cause lots of problems with speech. Environmental factors are another category of causes for language and speech disorders. Parental abuse and neglect. Children who are not exposed to language as much as they should be during the first 2-ish years of life are very likely to develop language and speech disorders. Language deprivation is really causes a lot of really severe negative developmental problems for a long time. Damage to the larynx. You can actually damage your own vocal cords by stressing them too much. Whether that's like speaking in a way that is stressing your vocal cords, or simply just like shouting and yelling too much. You can actually give yourself a speech disorder by shouting too much. Poverty and all the associated risks and stresses is predictive of language and speech disorders. Behavior and characteristics. So this is pretty important. Cognitively, no generalizations can be made concerning the cognitive characteristics of students with speech and language disorders. These are not disorders which primarily affect your cognitive characteristics. Academically, however, the nature of speech and language disorder is such that students who struggle with one of these disorders very frequently have serious academic problems and find learning very difficult. The ability to communicate and comprehend communication is central to learning almost from birth and throughout life. And all of these are kind of, they kind of stack onto each other, which is pretty apparent. Social and emotional. Lack of ability to communicate effectively has serious social and emotional side effects. Students may face teasing or bullying. They may be socially isolated from their peers, and even by friends and family. Emotionally, they are likely to have a poor self-concept and self-esteem. Students who cannot adequately express themselves are the likeliest to act out in socially or situationally inappropriate ways. So, we come to recommended interventions. And I just have a note here about how um, because speech and language is such a broad diagnosis, treatment and intervention is highly case specific. And what I've got here, I really can't. I don't have. There's not enough time or space in this presentation to go over, like, recommended interventions and strategies with really any depth at all. So what I have here is basically broad guidelines and generally accepted sort of interventions. So special education services will usually include working with a speech and language pathologist and a speech and language therapist. That's fairly basic. Almost any of the conditions that we've covered in this presentation are going to involve that. When it comes to like models for delivering those services to the children, things get a little bit complicated. There's a lot of different models. There's a lot of different ideas on how that should be done, whether that should be done as a pull-out model or whether that should be done as like class-wide interventions, so on and so forth. Interventions focus on developing phonemic awareness, memory, and language analysis skills are considered to be fairly effective. Supporting and reinforcing the relationship between spoken language and literacy skills. So in the minds of children with speech and language difficulties, those can seem like disconnected areas, and building bridges between spoken language and literacy skills, what they're reading on the page, what they're encountering in books, and so on and so forth. That can be a really effective intervention. Some individuals will require either aided or unaided augmented and alternative communication strategies. That's a mouthful, but aided means that this is a communication strategy that the individual needs some kind of equipment for. And unaided would be a communication strategy that they don't need any kind of equipment for. They can do it themselves. Sign language is the classic example, right? All you need are your hands. A communication board is the classic example for an aided communication strategy. I've got a picture of like a sample communication board here. There's other things like predictive keyboard technology that can be really good for kids that are able to express themselves in writing, but maybe they're lacking in motor skills. So it's very much a case-by-case basis, and there's a lot of different solutions out there. Parental involvement, of course, we all know, is very powerful. Parents should be educated about their children's needs and on exercises and policies to follow at home to support their child's speech and language development. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.